This movie is the next in my series discussing the observations and logic of natural selection. This is the second discussing the ecological components, the ecological observations, talking about logistic population growth. So, this series of videos is working through the observations and logical steps that Darwin went through in order to put together the theory of natural selection. This Darwin didn't necessarily lay it out in this framework. This was another biologist, Ernst Mayr, in the 20th century, was able to come up with this framework and show how all of these ideas interrelate. In the last video we talked about, in the last movie we talked about how populations have a tendency to grow exponentially, but that's only when resources are available, when resources are unlimited. Most populations tend to not increase exponentially for very long, or we don't even observe them increasing at all. We often see them being fairly stable. When I walk out into my yard, I usually have a handful of birds, a handful of squirrels. There's a certain number of weeds growing in my yard. My yard is never all weeds. There's never squirrels everywhere in all the trees. The populations are pretty much the same day to day, year to year. So populations aren't always randomly fluctuating. Populations aren't always rapidly growing. There's stability. Most populations are characterized by stability. So in this video, we'll break that down a little bit more. We'll unpack that. So again, all populations have the potential to increase in abundance exponentially whenever the number of offspring produced per female is greater than one. That can happen. So it's not just weeds or viruses or insect pests. It's literally any organism, even elephants, whales, have the ability to increase exponentially. However, Darwin made the observation that despite this ability to grow exponentially, we don't see populations aren't constantly growing everywhere. We're not constantly being overrun by rats or mice or insect pests, or our farms aren't being overgrown by trees or weeds. Populations tend to be stable over time. So while populations have the ability to grow exponentially, usually the way we see them, most populations are fairly stable over time. This point of stability has been called for 100 years or so now the carrying capacity. This is where if we were to observe a population increasing exponentially over time, this is represented by the asymptote, where the population levels off. We often don't see this phase of exponential growth. We just see the point where it increases, where it is at the asymptote. And this is the carrying capacity, often denoted by the letter K. This overall process, when we see exponential growth that is then followed by a leveling off, an asymptoting, we call this logistic population growth. And it occurs when there's some sort of carrying capacity, there's some sort of limiting factor that as the density increases, as the abundance increases over time, there's a decrease in population growth until the population reaches a stable point. This has been recorded. This process has been recorded many, many times. There's many examples. I'll use here an example of harbor seals from my home state of Washington State. Records from 1975 to 2000 indicate how there was initially a very low population of seals on this particular island. Due to changes in laws, they started to increase exponentially, and then very quickly, though, after only about 10 years, they reached the point where they leveled off, and the carrying capacity appears to be about 7,500. It's probably due to the limitation of resources. It could be due to the limitation of space. They need places in order to give birth and raise their young. They need places in order to sun themselves. There might be a limited number of spots on the island they live on in order to do that. One key feature of this graph is that the actual population abundance doesn't perfectly follow this curve. This is probably due to two factors. One is when they survey for this animal, it's not perfect. They overcount. They count some individuals twice. They miss some individuals. So they're going to be variable reports each year. Also, the other factor is that once you reach a carrying capacity, there's going to be some variation. This year, perhaps the winter was hard. Some more seals died than on average, but they increased back up to that carrying capacity. And that's another thing that you see when there is a carrying capacity to a population, when there is some sort of limitation, they might drop down temporarily, but they'll return, and they won't be up here. They won't increase exponentially forever. They'll increase to about the carrying capacity again. So as I mentioned before, this all relates to resources, which was another key observation that Darwin laid out. This carrying capacity is set by some sort of limitation in resources. We now also talk about how it's not necessarily just resources in terms of food and energy, but it can also be other limiting factors like the impacts of parasites or predators. But we often talk about it at first, during the first pass, as limitation of resources, the availability of food. For harbor seals, that would be the availability of fish, the number of fish that live in the water around their island they live on, the availability of nutrients if you're a plant, the availability of fresh water or rain if you're a plant, light if you're a plant. Space is very important to many organisms. Plants obviously run out of space when they're growing in the soil. They start bumping into each other. Harbor seals need space to sun themselves. They need place to give birth, that sort of thing. Many predators run out of space. Predators often have very large territories, so when you have a lot of predators in an area, their territories start bumping up into each other. You can't fit any more predators into that space. Same thing for birds. Many birds are highly territorial. There's only so many birds that can live in a forest because they have territories, and when there's only so many territories you can fit inside a given area of space. Marr puts it this way, succinctly: natural resources are limited. In a stable environment, they remain relatively constant. So a stable environment, year after year, there's a certain number of rocks on an island for a harbor seal to sun themselves on. That's going to remain constant. Occasionally there'll be a big storm or an earthquake that will change that, but that's going to be pretty constant. There's going to be a certain number of fish living in the ocean year after year because of the amount of space and energy and resources available to the fish. That's not going to change too much in a relatively stable environment. So this pattern of logistic population growth, this occurs when resources are limited, which is pretty much always going to be the case. So when populations are small, they will increase exponentially, and if there happens to be no limit on resources, they would continue to increase exponentially. But when resources are limited, after an initial phase of exponential population growth, a carrying capacity will eventually be reached. As we said, notice with the harbor seals, there can be variation around the carrying capacity. There can be fluctuations. Sometimes this is due to just errors in counting the organisms, but also has to do, the carrying capacity is set by the available resources. So in a year where where it's really sunny and lots of food has been produced for an organism, maybe an herbivore, its population could increase. If the next year it's colder, its population might go down. So there will be some variation. Marr put it this way: except for minor annual fluctuations and occasional major fluctuations, populations normally display stability. So for our harbor porpoises, perhaps some years there are a lot of fish. The fish population went up, so that harbor porpoises produced more babies. But then perhaps the next year there isn't as much fish, and so the population declines. There's not enough food to go around. But they will tend to cycle back and forth as conditions vary a little bit. There's these small phases of growth, phases of decline, but they tend to cycle around the carrying capacity, always returning to that carrying capacity K. So between this and the previous video, we've talked about Darwin's ecological observations and how Marr put them into a framework: growth, stability, and resources. Darwin then tied all of these together into his first inference, which we'll talk about in the next video.